Hello everyone and welcome. Today, let's talk about biological sex. Have you ever stopped to think about how humans are fundamentally divided into two groups? As you know, most animals are divided into male and female. By mating, they are able to produce offspring. Fundamentally, the primary goal of living organisms is reproduction. Every species strives to pass its genes to the next generation and propagate. But this raises an interesting question. Requiring two individuals to produce just a single offspring, isn't this system of biological sex incredibly inefficient? If we only had one sex, meaning asexual reproduction, reproduction would be much simpler. With the immense difficulties of finding a partner, why do we even have two sexes in the first place? Why not 3 or 4? In reality, almost all animals are limited to male and female. Today we will explore this biological riddle. Why are most animals limited to two sexes? Let's dive into the explanation. There are two primary ways organisms multiply: sexual and asexual reproduction. Essentially, this divides life into reproducing with or without sexes. While bacteria and similar organisms reproduce asexually, almost all animals reproduce sexually. This easily leads to the intuitive belief that sexual reproduction is a superior method. But in reality, it is not that simple. Sexual reproduction actually has two massive disadvantages. These are the twofold cost of sex and passing on only half of one's genes. The twofold cost of sex refers to the fact that it takes two parents to produce a single offspring, doubling the cost compared to asexual reproduction. In other words, you absolutely need a partner. As mentioned earlier, this is tremendously inefficient. Now, the second disadvantage, passing on only half of your genes, is also a huge drawback. Even if a theoretically perfect organism were to arise, its offspring would only receive half of that perfect genetic blueprint. Consequently, sexual reproduction cannot preserve a perfect genetic combination. When you think about it, these are indeed incredibly massive flaws. Many evolutionary biologists have wrestled with this exact problem. The phenomenon where organisms choose sexual reproduction, despite its immense obvious costs, is formally called the paradox of sexual reproduction. This fact continues to baffle scientists to this day. So, are there any leading explanations or established theories for why sex exists? The most widely cited explanation is the Red Queen hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that in order for a species to persist, it must constantly keep evolving. Much like how you have to run continuously on a treadmill just to stay in the same spot, you must keep running forward just to survive in this world. The name of this hypothesis is derived from Lewis Carroll's novel, Through the Looking Glass, and is based on a line spoken by the Red Queen chess piece. To make the benefits of sexual reproduction clearer, let's compare it with asexual reproduction. From an evolutionary perspective, the earliest organisms, such as bacteria like E. coli, multiply asexually through simple cell division. They duplicate their single-cell DNA and then split into two cells, repeating this process indefinitely. Under optimal conditions, E. coli can undergo cell division as quickly as once every 20 minutes. This leads to exponential, explosive growth. In terms of sheer reproductive efficiency, asexual reproduction is undoubtedly the strongest. Replicating once every 20 minutes is mind-blowing, especially when we humans might only produce 1 or 2 offspring in a lifetime. Bacteria are truly amazing. But of course, this system has a critical weakness. The offspring produced are nothing more than exact genetic copies. If the environment changes, or if a highly lethal disease begins to spread, every single descendant shares the exact same vulnerabilities, making them incredibly easy to wipe out entirely. Think of it like a game where your entire team is made up of the exact same character. They all share the same fatal weakness. In reality, the pathogens and viruses that threaten life mutate and change at an astonishing pace. Because they have very simple structures, they undergo mutations with ease. If complex organisms like us had to rely solely on random mutations to adapt, we would be far too slow. Our bodies are highly complex, making sudden beneficial mutations rare. Therefore, the strategy of immediately mixing genes with another individual to produce offspring is likely how we manage to survive. In other words, while it carries a high cost, it is infinitely better than total extinction. This hypothesis brilliantly explains the two major disadvantages of sexual reproduction. Even if your current genetic makeup is perfect, the external environment continues to evolve, meaning you must keep mixing your genes to stay alive. Additionally, another highly prominent theory is the DNA repair hypothesis. For instance, suppose a genetic mutation causes a portion of your genes to become damaged. While the underlying biological molecular details are quite complex, during the process of forming offspring, the intact chromosomes from the opposite sex can act as a template to repair the damaged genes. This suggests we reproduce sexually to prevent the accumulation of harmful genetic errors over generations. Now, while these hypotheses successfully demonstrate why having sex is better than not having sex, they don't actually explain why we need exactly two sexes. If the goal is simply to mix genes, it seems like having 3 or more sexes, where you can pair up with any non-identical sex to produce offspring, would be much better. With 2 sexes, the mathematical probability of finding a compatible mate in any random encounter is 1 in 2, 50%. But if there were 4 sexes, the probability of a random encounter being a compatible partner rises to 3 in 4, 75%. This is an incredibly sharp observation. The standard theories explain why sex is necessary, but fail to explain why we have exactly 2 sexes. In reality, certain species of single-celled paramecium are known to have up to 48 distinct mating types. For organisms like paramecium, whose physical habitats and movement are highly restricted, it is vital that whenever they happen to cross paths with another cell, the probability of a successful mating match is as high as possible. People often say there are plenty of fish in the sea, but biologically speaking, finding a partner can be extremely difficult. Having more sexes theoretically makes this much easier. Yet, almost all multicellular animals are limited to exactly 2 sexes. Why is this the case? To uncover the underlying reason, let's trace the evolutionary history of biological sex. When life first arose on Earth, the concept of biological sex did not exist. Around 4 billion years ago, the very first primitive life emerged. While the exact timeline remains slightly obscured, biological sex is believed to have originated around 2.3 billion years ago, alongside the rise of eukaryotic organisms. Up until that critical evolutionary junction, life forms reproduced entirely through asexual means. However, as we discussed earlier, asexual reproduction carries the immense, constant threat of total extinction. To circumvent this, primitive organisms developed a mechanism to physically exchange pieces of their genetic code. This evolutionary process is called conjugation. Of course, exchanging genes with yourself or an identical genetic clone serves no evolutionary purpose. Therefore, they needed to make sure they conjugated with a distinct, non-identical cell. These recognizable distinctions are called mating types, which represent the true evolutionary precursor to biological sex. You might notice, however, that this genetic exchange process does not actually increase the number of living individuals, and that is completely correct. The primary, immediate objective of conjugation or sexual reproduction is not to simply multiply, but to firmly maintain genetic diversity within the species. Now, let us trace how biological sex continued to evolve from there. As these primitive organisms continuously conjugated, genetic diversity ballooned, leading to clear differences in physical characteristics and morphology. Eventually, this gave rise to reproduction involving cells of distinctly different physical sizes. These specialized reproductive cells that fuse together to form a new life are called gametes. In humans, gametes are represented by sperm and eggs. In other words, organisms began producing either very large gametes or very small gametes. This was a highly logical evolutionary path. The very core value of sexual reproduction lies in diversity, so it makes sense that physical differentiation would naturally occur. Now, let's carefully evaluate the physical advantages and disadvantages of gamete size. Naturally, large gametes contain an abundance of rich nutritional reserves to support the offspring. However, because they require massive resources, you can only produce a few of them. Furthermore, because they are structurally heavy, they are highly immobile and struggle to navigate to find a partner. Conversely, small gametes carry almost no internal nutritional payload, but they can be manufactured in astronomical quantities. And because they are lightweight, they are incredibly agile and have a very high chance of locating a partner. To sum it up, large gametes offer nutrients but lack quantity and mobility, while small gametes offer high quantity and mobility but lack nutrients. Now, let's simulate evolutionary competition among 3 different gamete sizes: large, medium, and small. First, large gametes have a massive advantage in attracting partners. Because they offer abundant resources, other gametes aggressively seek them out to fuse with them. Meanwhile, small gametes face high individual mortality. But because they are released in massive numbers and are highly mobile, they are excellent at finding mates. They might not be highly desired on their own, but their sheer volume of mating attempts guarantees success. On the other hand, the medium-sized gametes find themselves in a truly tragic evolutionary position. They are mediocre in both resource content and mobility, making them highly uncompetitive. Consequently, evolutionary selection forces gametes to polarize into 2 extremes, either very large or very small. The middle ground is completely phased out due to its competitive disadvantage. Next, let's analyze the pairing patterns of these gametes. A fusion of 2 large gametes would theoretically produce an exceptionally well-nourished offspring, which is highly advantageous. However, because both are highly immobile, the actual probability of 2 large gametes successfully finding each other is close to 0. On the flip side, 2 small gametes can find each other with ease, but because they both contain 0 nutritional payload, the resulting offspring is far too weak and quickly dies. As a result, only the pairing of 1 small gamete and 1 large gamete emerged as a viable, evolutionary stable strategy. In human biology, this small mobile gamete is the sperm, and the large nutritious gamete is the egg. And naturally, organisms that produce sperm became male, and those that produce eggs became female. As you are likely aware, this is beautifully illustrated in humans. In a single male ejaculation, roughly 100 to 200 million sperm are released. In contrast, a biological female will only produce about 500 mature eggs in her entire lifetime. The physical size of the egg is also exponentially larger than the sperm. These distinct characteristics are the direct result of intense, historical evolutionary competition. Ultimately, gametes split into large and small variants, and because only large plus small fusions were viable, biological sex split into exactly 2 categories. You might wonder why we can't simply produce offspring with members of our same sex. But as evolutionary selection shows us, the fusion of same-size gametes was heavily selected against and ultimately phased out. Then wouldn't the ultimate survival strategy be to produce both eggs and sperm within the same body? This concept is known as hermaphroditism, where a single individual possesses both male and female reproductive systems. And indeed, there are species that evolved exactly this way. This is highly common in plants, and slow-moving animals like snails are also hermaphrodites. In this system, any encounter with another member of your species can successfully lead to reproduction. However, for active mobile animals that can easily navigate to find mates, dedicating energy to a single biological sex is much more cost-effective. Possessing both reproductive systems makes an already complex biological anatomy even more complicated and decreases the developmental reliability of both systems. This is illustrated by the real-world existence of congenital infertility and developmental errors. Therefore, hermaphroditic strategies are generally restricted to organisms that have an extremely low probability of ever encountering another partner. Plants cannot move at all, and snails crawl at a snail's pace, because finding a partner is incredibly rare for them. They chose the evolutionary path of hermaphroditism to guarantee successful reproduction. Now, let's explore what would happen in a hypothetical world where a species had exactly 3 sexes. Imagine we have sex A, sex B, and sex C. While finding a partner might be easier, evolutionary modeling predicts that the sex ratio within the population would inevitably become heavily skewed. Under the assumption that any 2 distinct sexes can produce offspring, in reality, all 3 sexes would never be equally successful at attracting partners. A clear hierarchy of mating preference would naturally emerge. No matter how close their starting points, subtle variations would dictate a hierarchy. If the hierarchy of mating preference is ranked A, B, and then C, A and B will mate most frequently, producing offspring that are also either A or B. In contrast, the least preferred sex C will struggle to find mating partners, failing to pass on their genetic material. This causes the population of sex C to continuously shrink. Essentially, only the top 2 preferred sexes will experience population growth. In a standard 2-sex system, if the population of females increases, males naturally find mates much easier. This natural advantage drives the birth rate of males back up, maintaining a stable sex ratio. But in a 3-sex system, because the top 2 sexes, A and B, can successfully sustain reproduction on their own, A and B will simply keep multiplying while C continues to fade away. Ultimately, sex C will face total evolutionary extinction, forcing the species to revert back to exactly 2 sexes. Therefore, for organisms that can freely move and search for partners, there is no long-term evolutionary benefit to maintaining more than 2 biological sexes. And that concludes our biological exploration for today. To summarize, biological sex and gamete size have co-evolved through incredibly intricate processes. We hope you enjoyed diving into this fascinating and mysterious biological system. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once remarked, "Marry and you will regret it. Don't marry and you will also regret it." While other animals choose partners strictly through the cold lens of maximizing reproductive survival, humans are unique because we choose our partners with our hearts. Those who choose partners based on emotional connections rather than raw genetic fitness have, in a sense, transcended the evolutionary constraints of biological sex. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.